Today, we are here for our fourth interview on LionWeb, and we are going through this interview to show the different perspective from different contributors to LionWeb. And today, we are lucky enough to have Niko Stotz with us here. So, hi, Niko.
Hey, glad to be here.
Great. And Niko is a DSL specialist, has been for quite some time, has worked at very notable companies in the field, both in Germany and the Netherlands. For example, Itemis, Canon, and now Fire. By the way, Fire, and I have a cup I received from Fire, kindly sponsored the first two dinners that we have at LionWeb, so we are grateful for that. And Niko co-founded Fire a couple of years ago, and Fire is a company specialized on model-driven development. Now, Niko has used a lot of different modeling technologies, but in particular, in the last few years, he has focused on MPS. And I remember some interesting presentation that he gave, for example, of making MPS interpreters way more efficient. So it's nice to take advantage of his expertise with some questions about LionWeb. So I will start with asking, why did you decide to join LionWeb?
Yeah, so for one, as I said, I'm in this field for a long time. So I worked with different technologies. I have a long-standing interest in these technologies. And yeah, looking at the meta level of everything is like very intrinsic to modeling people, right? And so at some point you also look at the commonalities between different modeling ecosystems. I don't know if this is then meta or meta orthogonal. I don't know how to name it, but I worked with several of them also quite intensively. So with EMF and XTech things, I've worked for several years, and MPS, and also at some customers with homegrown modeling systems. And in the end, you're mostly solving the same problems if you are on the modeling framework level, right? Of course, with every customer, you solve a different business problem, but the technological problems are often very similar. And especially with EMF, there are some things you realized they were missing in the framework, and I implemented them like again at every single customer, and then again at MPS, and then again at other systems, and this gets boring. So having a common way to do this is very much in my interest. And also, I really think this is LionWeb is the logical next step for modeling, or DSLs, or whatever term you want to use. And I'm really excited to be part of this next step.
Good. And well, given your expertise with a lot of different modeling technologies, I think you are in a good position to comment on what benefit LionWeb could bring to the community overall, to the language engineering community.
Mm-hmm. I think there is a bit of one background of to understand the benefit is LSP, language server protocol, right? So the idea was, when this was developed in the context of Visual Studio Code, that there are tons of programming languages and there are tons of IDEs or smart editors. And before this, every single IDE had to implement the logic to understand every single programming language on their own. So Eclipse had to implement Java logic, the logic to understand Java, and IntelliJ and Visual Studio, and now Visual Studio Code, and everybody else again. And they thought this is not a great idea. And LSP was the logical solution to this, right? You say you have a standard protocol, which the language server protocol, which the editors can speak, and some tool which knows everything about the language can speak. And then essentially every tool provider just needs to provide the editors and the go-to definition facilities and things like that. And every programming language just needs to provide the language server for their language. And then you have a huge benefit because everybody does what they do best and can benefit from each other. And I think LionWeb can do the same thing for modeling, because we have quite a few established modeling systems. Yeah, we already mentioned EMF and NPS. And yeah, we can mention a few more: Monticore, SpoofX, Rascal, MetaEdit, probably a few I forgot. And all of these tools have decades of development behind them. So also thousands of hours that were spent on them, because they need all of these systems are pretty mature, and having a mature modeling system is a lot of effort, right? It's a complex topic, and to have a mature system, you need a lot of different parts. You need some way to manage the structure and the syntax, and the scoping and type system and checkers and generators and interpreters and parsers and maybe graphical editors and 15 other aspects. And essentially, each of these systems are their own island. They don't talk to each other. And also, all of these systems are mostly pretty old. So they are all essentially desktop applications. And nowadays, everything needs to be in the web. And I think nobody wants or can afford to spend another decade to re-implement parts or all of this for each of these systems, again, for the web. So we can do the same thing as LSP does. We've tried to define a protocol where you can put these different components together so they can talk to each other, and everybody can focus on the thing that they can do good. And yeah, I think there were several. Every time you talk to people in any of these communities, they all say, yes, this is the obviously right thing to do, so we should do it.
Yeah, and I mean, when you say that, something comes to mind is also that building this foundation to bring this technology on the web is something that most clients, I guess, would not be willing to pay for because they want their own specific things. So building these common technologies, something that if we can provide as a community, I think makes a lot of sense. And
yes.
good.
And I think also these, of course, building this still takes time, right? But with each client, you're in a better position to say, okay, what about you co-invest in, I don't know, implementing a nice generator component, which we then, the reusable parts can be open sourced. But for this, you get all the other components essentially for free from the community. So the usual community aspect.
Yeah, sense. And can I ask you, what are you working on at the moment?
Maybe there's one other thing I wanted to mention for what's a benefit for the community. I think it's really helpful to have these discussions in the open. So how this protocol should look, because yeah, so we're now doing this for 3/4 of a year, right? And if I think about all the details we discussed, and there are a lot of details, right? I think it really helps to have these discussions in the open and having like not like some players who say, I do it, and whoever else can go along or can go to hell, essentially. And also, I find it really important to have the rationale for these decisions somehow accessible. For us, to the usual reasons, right? For us in a year to see why the heck did we decide this stupid idea. in this way, and also for others to be able to read up about it and understand it or challenge it, but based on thorough understanding.
Good. And so maybe we can now go back to the question about what you are working on at this moment.
Yeah, thanks. So for once, I somehow got into the role to moderate the weekly sessions we have in the LionWeb group and also documenting this. So I'm trying the last thing I just said to make sure the stuff is the discussions are accessible to everybody. I spent quite some time in writing these down and make it accessible. And also I'm implementing the NPS part of LionWeb as far as it currently exists. Yeah, so to make NPS both a repository for LionWeb protocol and also a client for LionWeb protocol. It's currently more in a prototypical state, but it's getting in the right direction. So there are already people who use it.
Good. Maybe we can underline that all the material you have been working on is publicly available. I mean, this documentation about LionWeb. I think if you type lionweb.io, it redirects you to our GitHub repository, and there are parts that are public, like this documentation. And we can also say that I think the NPS bindings are also published on Maven Central, I think, at this point.
Yes, there is one version published. As we don't have any regular users yet, the publishing happens whenever we need to. But of course, as soon as somebody really wants to use this, we can make this a bit more thorough process.
Yeah, and can we maybe discuss a little more about the bindings for NPS that you have built on? So what kind of features they provide?
Yeah, happy to. So I wrote a lot of converters between different representations, especially of languages. Yeah, if you look into the guts of NPS, they have like 3 different ways internally to represent languages. And then, of course, we have the LionWeb protocol version of representing languages. And then, so that's the M2 level, right, in the meta model. And then we also have instances of this, right? We have regular models, and they need to be representable in both LionWeb and in NPS. So I wrote converters between all of these. And so you can, to enable these things I mentioned before, that NPS can be the LionWeb repository and also the LionWeb client, and can import and export JSON files in LionWeb format. So that's at the moment the main use case.
Good. And so we have seen that LionWeb is about integration. So maybe I was wondering if you have an idea of what kind of integration would be the most useful for LionWeb.
I think the most important and useful at the moment would be some nice system based on LionWeb, which is useful by web developers. Because I think in the LionWeb group, that's a part where we are lacking quite a bit. Most of us are from this older generation of language workbenches, right? All desktop oriented. And web is, let's say, not our first nature. But this is where most development nowadays happens, right? And where also this protocol-based approach is most useful. So I think it would be really good that if we had a system, which essentially you can write npm LionWeb, install LionWeb example server or something like this. And then you get a base system where you can, you have a web-based client and some kind of repository, maybe even with some kind of real-time collaboration, because in the web you want this, that you can start to play with and use as a base. I think that would be really, really useful also to extend our community in this direction.
Good, good. And yeah, no, by the way, about DSL and the web, I think the book from Mente is about to be published, and yes, some discussion about building DSLs for the web. Maybe that is another piece of the puzzle to facilitate adopting DSL in the web.
So this is this DSL beginners book, or
yes,
or is
I
it a
think
different book?
it's called business-friendly DSLs, and yeah, I think it's suitable also for beginners to really learn what DSLs are about and implementing them without the huge background in understanding EMF first and all these things.
Nice.
And well, maybe we can talk a little bit about Fire and how do you think that Fire could benefit from LionWeb?
Mm-hmm. So LionWeb is a consulting company in principle, right? So of course we would like to use LionWeb components in our consulting engagements, both as components which we can reuse, which are hopefully already there, and also maybe contribute to the together with our clients to the LionWeb community by developing components. I mentioned it briefly before, right? So if some customer really needs lots of code generation, it also for them, just as from a business point of view, makes sense to implement a very efficient code generator component for which can plug in with the rest of the system. Or I don't know if a client would have really high requirements on a well-formed model, then it probably might make sense for them to also pay for implementing a good type checking component. Another thing, which you mentioned it briefly, one of my other pet peeves is interpreters. So I'm really hoping for, and there are some candidates, that I could implement an LionWeb interpreter component, which would run the GraalVM interpreters, which should perform pretty well.
Good. So looking forward to that. And can I ask you instead, what do you think that would help making LionWeb successful?
I think the main thing we need is usable components, right? Which are not only which are available, both for to toy around with them, which basically means they should be open source, because otherwise it's hard to toy around with stuff, but also commercially, because I think one big part of LionWeb is also we want to make sure we can use this stuff in commercial context. So they should also not be only prototypes, but really something I can use and don't need to be afraid that it blows up in my face on every second turn I take. And this is, of course, a bit of a chicken and egg problem, right? So it's useful once there are components, and I can only write components if it's useful. So, but I think we are on the way to start with a base layer, right? We, for example, also the Java implementation of the protocol that you wrote is really helpful there, and Mente is working on solid JavaScript implementation or TypeScript implementation, and the full implementation web editor, which would be a huge effort to implement for anybody on their own. But Jos is doing a lot of this work and really on a production level quality. So I think we are kickstarted. So we're on a good path there.
And for my final question, can you think of someone we should involve or contact to help us making LionWeb successful?
Yeah, I think this nicely closes the loop to the very beginning, right? Currently, the most people who are really involved in LionWeb are in the MPS community, and quite a few of them have a history with EMF. But there are these other language systems. I mentioned a few before, and there are also some of the newer ones. I don't know, Langnium or Essential or Generative Objects, or yeah, probably quite a few are missing. I think it would really help to integrate with them, because yeah, as long as we essentially try to get MPS in the web, that's one idea which is already helpful. But the real power of this would come if also these other communities we could join in, and also learn from them, right? Because yeah, of course, currently all our ideas about the protocol are mostly informed by the stuff we know, which is MPS and EMF. And if it should really be a more generic protocol, then it would be very, very helpful to have input from these other communities. So it also works for them.
Good. So I guess we have some work to do. But for today, I think we have answered all the questions. So thank you very much for your time.
Thank you for hosting these interviews.
Bye.
Bye.